In the spring of 1926, an Osage woman sat in a courtroom and listened as a man she had trusted began explaining how her family had been taken apart one person at a time. At first, she stayed very still, with her hands folded in her lap, because by then she had already buried her mother, her sisters, and people she loved so many times that shock probably felt almost familiar. But then the man kept talking. And as he did, the woman learned that the sickness in her own body had not been bad luck, and it had not been age, and it had not been some mysterious illness. The doctors just could not understand. It meant she had been next. To understand how a whole family reached that courtroom, you have to go back to Osage County, Oklahoma, in the early 1920s, when the ground itself had made one group of people unbelievably rich. The Osage Nation had been forced west through treaty after treaty, and by the time they reached what became their reservation in Oklahoma, they had already lost land, people, and almost every promise the United States had made to them. But in one of the most important decisions in the nation's history, Osage leaders kept control of what was under the land. And what was under the land was oil. By the 1920s, oil derricks stood across the prairie like black metal skeletons. They pumped day and night, and the money from those leases flowed into something called headrights, which were shares of the Osage mineral estate. Every Osage-uity had a share, and that share could be inherited. So on paper, the system looked simple. Oil came out of the ground. Royalties came in. And the money went to the people who owned the mineral rights. But in real life, the money drew people to Osage County who did not come to admire the Osage, or work with them, or even really know them. They came because they saw wealth. They saw cars with drivers. They saw large houses and fine clothes and bank accounts full of oil money. And then they looked at the law, and they saw something even more useful. A headright could pass to a legal heir. So if a white man married an Osage woman, and if people in her family began dying, the money did not disappear. It moved. One of the Osage women living inside that world was Mollie Kyle, later Mollie Burkhart. Mollie was quiet, Catholic, serious, and very close to her family. She lived in and around Fairfax, where the roads could be dusty and open, where people knew whose car had gone by, whose lights were on late, and whose family had eaten dinner together the night before. And Mollie came from a family that, by every outward measure, should have been safe. Her mother, Lizzie Q., was older and respected. Her sisters, Anna and Rita, moved in and out of Mollie's life with the ordinary closeness of siblings, stopping by, talking, arguing, needing rides, needing help, sharing news and taking up space in the house the way family does. Mollie had also married a white man named Ernest Burkhart. Ernest was not rich on his own, but he was connected to a powerful cattleman in the county, a man people called the King of the Osage Hills. That cattleman was William Hale. Hale owned land, had business interests, knew judges and lawyers and lawmen, and moved through Osage County with the kind of confidence that makes people lower their voices when he enters a room. He could be warm when he wanted to be. He could offer help. He could put a hand on someone's shoulder and speak like a friend. And because of that, a lot of people did not see him as danger. They saw him as a man who knew how things worked. For Mollie, ordinary life was already complicated enough. She had children. She had family. She had money coming in from headrights, but that money did not mean freedom in the way outsiders imagine. Many Osage people were forced into guardianship arrangements, where white guardians controlled or managed money that belonged to Osage citizens. So even wealth came with somebody else's hand hovering over it. A person could be rich and still have to ask permission. Then, in 1921, Mollie's sister Anna disappeared. Anna Brown was 36 years old, and she was known around Fairfax. She had been seen drinking, riding in cars, moving between people who treated her like company when it suited them, and like a problem when it did not. On one of those last nights, Anna was out with people she knew. She got into a car, likely thinking it was just another ride, Another late night, another trip across roads she had traveled many times before. Maybe she adjusted her coat against the night air. Maybe she leaned against a seat and watched the dark prairie pass by the window. And then she did not come home. At first, there was no clear answer. People asked around. Mollie listened for news. Someone might have seen Anna here. Someone else might have heard she was there. But days passed, and the worry in Mollie's house stopped being ordinary worry and became the kind that makes people sit awake in the dark, replaying the last time they saw someone and wondering what they missed. Then Anna's body was found in a ravine. She'd been there long enough that at first the truth was not obvious. Some officials tried to treat it like maybe it was alcohol, maybe exposure, maybe one more tragic death that did not need too many questions asked. But the undertaker found a bullet hole in the back of Anna's head. Anna had not wandered off and died. Someone had killed her. For Mollie, the news did not stay in one place. It moved through the house, into the kitchen, into the bedrooms, into every conversation where somebody tried to speak calmly and failed. Lizzie Q, Mollie's mother, was already unwell. She had the look of someone whose body was being slowly worn down, and in the middle of grief the family had to watch her grow weaker too. 2 months after Anna was found, Lizzie died. And again, it could be explained away if someone wanted badly enough to explain it away. Lizzie was older. People got sick. Families had bad luck. But Mollie was standing inside that bad luck, and from where she stood it was starting to feel like the walls were moving closer. Across Osage County, the fear was spreading beyond Mollie's family. Other Osage people were turning up dead. Some were shot. Some died after sudden illnesses. Some simply vanished. Dogs that families kept for protection were found dead too. And every time another person died, the same quiet question moved from porch to porch and table to table. Who was next? Local lawmen did not seem able or willing to stop it. Private detectives came and went. Some took money and produced nothing. Some followed leads that seemed to go nowhere. And some people just said they had information were threatened, chased off, or killed. So the Osage were living with something worse than murder. They were living with murder that seemed protected. One story in particular frightened people because it showed what could happen when somebody got too close to the truth. An Osage man named George Burkhart became sick after drinking what doctors suspected was poisoned whiskey. Before he died, he wanted to speak to an attorney named W.W. Fallen because Burkhart believed he knew things about the murders that mattered. So Vaughn came to him, listened, and then started back home with information that might have helped explain what was happening in Osage County. But Vaughn never got to walk into a safe room and tell that story. He was killed after being thrown from a train. And when Tom White looked at deaths like that, he was not just looking at murder anymore. He was looking at a system that punished people for knowing too much. Then Henry Rowan was found dead. Henry was another person connected to Mollie's family, and in early 1923 he was found in his car on the Osage Reservation with a gunshot wound to the head. There was a detail about Henry that made investigators uneasy. A life insurance policy had been taken out on him, and the beneficiary was William Hale. Hale called Henry his friend. Hale even acted like a grieving man. But to anyone watching closely, the money sat there in the middle of the story like a loaded gun on a table. And then in March of 1923, the violence became impossible to mistake for anything else. Mollie's sister Rita lived in Fairfax with her husband, Bill Smith. Their house was an ordinary place until the night it exploded. The blast tore through the home with such force that people nearby felt it in their own bodies before they understood what they had heard. Windows shook. People ran outside. And where Rita and Bill's house had been, there was wreckage, smoke, splintered wood, and people screaming in the dark. Rita was killed. Their housekeeper, Nettie Brookshire, was killed. Bill Smith survived for a short time with terrible injuries, long enough to try to tell people what he believed had happened. Then Bill died too. By then, Mollie was the last sister alive. Imagine being her in those days. You wake up in a house that still has children's sounds in it. Small feet, small voices, the ordinary clatter of breakfast, and then underneath all of that is the knowledge that your family is being erased. You sit at a table and someone brings you coffee or medicine, and your hand closes around the cup, and for a second you wonder whether anything in your own house is safe. You go to church and feel people looking. You hear men outside talking low. You see a car slowed near the road and keep moving. And every death has moved the money closer to you. Mollie herself was growing sick. She was weak, tired, and fading in a way that did not feel normal. People could say it was diabetes or grief or nerves or just another illness. But Mollie's body knew something was wrong before the law was ready to say it. She lay in bed while the world around her kept trying to make explanations sound reasonable. And all the while, the deaths continued to orbit her. By this point, the Osage Tribal Council had had enough. They asked the federal government to send help. And eventually, the Bureau of Investigation, the agency that would later become the FBI, assigned agents to the case. The man who became the main investigator was Tom White. White was not flashy. He had been a Texas Ranger, and he had the kind of lawman presence that did not need much decoration. When he arrived in Oklahoma, he did not step into a clean case with clear evidence and cooperative witnesses. He stepped into a county where nearly everyone was afraid of someone, owed money to someone, or had learned that talking could get you killed. White opened files. He read names, dates, insurance policies, land records, probate documents, and witness statements that contradicted each other. He looked at Anna Brown, shot and left in a ravine. He looked at Lizzie Q, dead after a wasting sickness. He looked at Henry Rowan, shot in his car with an insurance policy pointing toward Hale. He looked at Rita and Bill Smith's house, blown apart in Fairfax. And then he looked at Mollie, still alive but sick, sitting in the center of all that death. The problem was that suspicion was not proof. Hale's name kept coming up. People whispered it. Some said it directly and then looked over their shoulders. But Hale was powerful, and powerful men do not usually leave the easy kind of evidence behind. He had friends. He had money. He had people willing to lie. And he had built a world where witnesses had to ask themselves whether telling the truth was worth dying for. So White did not just send agents around with badges showing. He put men undercover. One moved through the county as an insurance salesman. Another as a cattle buyer. Another as an oil prospector. Another as a medicine man or herbal doctor, someone who could hear things a regular federal agent would never hear. They sat in rooms where people drank and talked too much. They stood beside corrals. They listened at counters, in offices, outside courthouse doors, and in places where the wrong sentence could change everything. Little by little, the silence began to crack. A criminal talked. Then another person talked. Someone admitted a ride. Someone described a payment. Someone else named the man who had given the order. White could feel the shape of the case changing under his hands. It was not one murder anymore. It was a machine. And then one person inside the family circle finally broke. Based on confessions, court testimony, and federal evidence, this is what investigators believed happened to Mollie Burkhart's family. The plan did not start with a gunshot or a bomb. It started with arithmetic. The person behind the plot understood the headrights. They understood inheritance. They understood that if one Osage family member died, the money moved to the next legal heir. So the deaths had to happen in an order that looked from far enough away like misfortune. One illness. One shooting. One accident. One house exploding in the night. First, the plotters watched Anna Brown. Anna was vulnerable in the way people become vulnerable when others have decided their life is worth less than the money attached to it. On the night she was taken out, the people around her did not act like strangers. That was the trap. She got into a car with people she had reason to recognize. The car moved away from town, away from the lights, away from anyone who might ask why Anna looked uneasy or why the road had gone so quiet. Out in the dark, one of the men steadied himself. He had been sent there for a reason. And when Anna was in the ravine with no storefronts, no neighbors, and no family close enough to hear her, he fired into the back of her head. After that, the plotters let the county do what they expected the county to do. They let confusion settle over the body. They let people talk about alcohol, an accident, and bad luck. And they watched the first share of the money move. Then Lizzie Q weakened. In the house, her family saw an older woman getting sicker. They saw her body shrinking under blankets. They heard the low voices around her bed. They watched cups and medicine and meals pass through the room like ordinary things. But according to the case built later, this was not ordinary sickness. This was part of the same plan, quiet enough to hide inside grief. The plotters kept going. Henry Rowan trusted the wrong friendship. He got into a car or stopped on a lonely road, and the man with him knew exactly why he was there. There was whiskey. There was talk. Maybe Henry leaned back in the seat, tired, not realizing that the person beside him was waiting for the moment when the road was empty enough. Then the gun came up, and Henry Rowan was shot in the head. But the plotters still needed Rita. Rita's house in Fairfax had to be destroyed because a shooting would bring too many questions by then. So men moved around the house with explosives, carrying something powerful enough to turn walls into pieces. They worked in the dark. They kept their voices low. They placed the charge and then backed away from the home where Rita, Bill, and Nettie Brookshire were sleeping or settling into the night. A fuse was set. A man walked away, and then the house exploded. The blast ripped the night open. Wood flew outward. Glass broke. People nearby ran toward the noise before they even understood what they were running toward. Inside the wreckage, Rita was gone. Nettie was gone. Bill was horribly injured, but still alive long enough to try to point toward the people responsible. And somewhere outside that wreckage, the plotters had to understand that the money had moved again. Now Mollie was standing almost alone. And because she had inherited what was left, she was no longer just the grieving sister. She was the last barrier. So the plan turned inward, into her own home and her own body. Mollie was sick, and the sickness kept being explained to her in ways that sounded medical, reasonable, and safe. She was given treatments. She was given things to swallow. She lay in bed while the people around her acted like they were helping. But the people trying to save her were not all trying to save her. The poison was already inside the story. The mastermind was William K. Hale. The man inside Mollie's home was Ernest Burkhart, her husband. Once those names were finally spoken plainly, the whole case changed shape. Hale was not just a powerful cattleman who happened to know everyone. He was the man that early investigators said had arranged the killings so the headrights would move through Mollie's family in the order he needed. Ernest was not just Mollie's husband watching tragedy strike around him. He was part of the plot, the man close enough to the family to know the routines, the rooms, the illnesses, the money, and the fear. The hired men now had names too. John Ramsey was tied to Henry Rowan's murder. Kelsey Morrison admitted killing Anna Brown and said Hale had asked him to do it. Others were pulled into the bomb plot and the cover-up, while some people who could have testified died before they ever reached a witness stand. And the more White's team pulled at the case, the more it showed the same thing underneath. This had never been a string of separate tragedies. It was a conspiracy built around oil money. For Mollie, the reveal was almost beyond comprehension. The man she had lived beside, the man who had been in her house while her sisters were dying, had helped open the door to the people destroying her family. And while she had been lying sick, trying to survive what everyone kept calling illness, investigators believed she was being poisoned too. When Mollie was removed from that environment and properly treated, she recovered. That recovery said what the polite explanations had tried not to say. Someone had been trying to kill her. In 1926, Hale, Ernest Burkhart, and John Ramsey were indicted. Ernest first pleaded not guilty, but during the legal process he changed course and told the story that helped expose the plot. The trials were difficult, messy, and stretched across years, with changed venues, hung juries, appeals, pressure on witnesses, and attempts to twist the case back into confusion. But eventually, Hale and Ramsey were convicted for the murder of Henry Rowan. Hale was sentenced to life in prison in January of 1929. Ramsey also received a life sentence. Ernest Burkhart received a life sentence connected to the Smith bombing after his plea and testimony. But the final punishment did not feel final to many Osage people. Hale was paroled in 1947. Ramsey was also paroled. Ernest Burkhart was eventually released, returned to prison after a later burglary, released again, and later received a pardon. The people who had helped expose the plot had risked their lives, and the family at the center of it had been nearly wiped out, but the men behind it did not spend the rest of their lives behind bars. And even the convictions did not close the larger story. The Hale-Burkhart plot explained murders around Mollie, but the Reign of Terror was bigger than one family. Across Osage County, dozens of suspicious deaths remained unanswered. Some were written off as illness, some as accidents, some as disappearances no one powerful cared enough to solve. And in many of those cases, the money still moved. As for Mollie, she survived. She divorced Ernest. She lived with the knowledge that the people closest to her had not only failed to protect her family, but had helped destroy it. And every time the oil money was discussed, every time someone said head right or inheritance or guardianship, like those were just legal words, Mollie knew what they had cost. The Reign of Terror ended with some convictions, but many Osage families were left with names they could never clear, graves they could never explain, and questions no court ever answered. Everything you just heard is based on real events. Some details have been reconstructed or dramatized for the sake of the story, but the core of it, the Osage headrights, the murders, the investigation, and the conspiracy against Mollie Burkhart's family, that all happened. Thank you for listening to the SCP Labs podcast. If you enjoyed this one, please follow and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. It genuinely helps, more than you know. Until next time.